Welcome back to Chess Dog, and today we've got a special treat and an acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge the achievement of American player Carissa Yip. She's a women's Grandmaster and an international master, and she has just won the United States Women's Championship. She entered into the tournament, I believe, and you may know better if you do comment down below, but she entered, I believe, the second highest rated woman in the United States. After the tournament and after her victory, she, I believe, is the highest rated woman in the United States with the United States Chess Federation rating of 25-12, passing Irina Krush. And today I want to celebrate by showing one of Carissa Yip's most interesting and entertaining games, a really fun game that she played against Tatev Abrahamyan. And this is a great attacking game, and I think you'll really enjoy it. And if you happen to play the opening in question, you'll gain a lot of benefit from this game as well. Carissa began with e4, and Abrahamyan plays e6. They get into the French defense. Carissa Yip plays e5, c5, c3, knight c6, knight f3, queen to b6. This is the standard starting moves of the French advance variation. And usually white will play a3 or bishop e2 in this position, but Carissa Yip plays bishop to d3, the Milner-Berry gambit. Now, many years ago, this was considered a coffee house opening. It was one of those openings that worked if black didn't know what to do, but if black knew what to do, not only would black equalize, but black would end up with a better position. It went something like this in those days. Black would take on d4, and if white takes on d4, that would be the normal move in the past, the mainline Milner-Berry. There's a little trap. Black cannot take the pawn, even though it's hanging. If he or she does, knight d4, queen d4, then bishop to b5 check, and that reveals an attack on the queen, and black would lose the queen. So what they would do in this position is play bishop to d7 to cover that check first. Then white would castle to gambit the pawn on d4. Knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen d4, knight c3. And here white would be threatening a knight jump into b5, hitting the queen. And after the queen moves back to, say, b6 to cover the knight to c7 check threat, white plays bishop e3 and gets really nasty tactics. And if black were to take the knight with the bishop, then white recaptures with the bishop, bishop b5 check. It's a bad position. But if black knew one move here, black could usually get a better position, and that move is a6. Black controls b5, keeps the knight out, and it was just understood that black was a little bit better in this position, and if you knew this is black, no one would play the Milner-Berry. But with the modern computers, new advances, opening theory has adjusted. And in this position, a recent innovation is being played by a lot of very strong players. In fact, the strongest player to play this Milner-Berry gambit in the modern era is none other than world champion Magnus Carlsen. He's played this against top competition. And the new move, the move that sort of changed everything, is castling. And tension builds. White doesn't want to take on d4, and black doesn't want to take on c3. White would love to have black take on c3 and develop his knight, with one tempo above the old main line. Black plays bishop to d7. White plays rook to e1. Again, neither side wants to take on d4 or c3. Knight ge7. What black wants to do is play that knight to g6, play the queen back to c7, and then go after that pawn on e5. So white responds to knight ge7 with h4. This way, if the knight goes to g6, white can play h5 and control that g6 square. Here, black plays a6, and the idea behind a6 is the same as in the main line, to control that b5 square, and we'll see that in a variation here pretty soon. Carissa Yip goes ahead and plays h5, gaining kingside space and controlling the g6 square. Tatev Abrahamyan plays h6, and here Carissa Yip plays a novelty, queen to e2. Before, Johnny Hector, a grandmaster that plays this opening on a regular basis, had played bishop to c2 to allow that queen to put pressure on d4. Gawain Jones, in a recent book that he wrote, recommends this opening in his repertoire, and here he recommends the move a3, again delaying that capture on d4. After rook c8, b4, dc3, knight c3, it looks like black has a tactic, knight b4, unleashing an attack on the undefended knight on c3, but after knight a4, bishop a4, queen a4 check, knight b c6, bishop d2, queen c7, queen to g4, black is up 2 pawns, and opinions vary on this position, but Gawain Jones actually likes this position for white. He's not claiming white's clearly better, but he thinks this is a very playable position. I put it into my computers. They all give it 0.00. They see this as completely equal, even though black is up 2 pawns. But Carissa plays queen to e2. The best move here is probably dc3. This is not the move Tatev played. And the idea here is after knight c3, black goes ahead and plays knight to d4, just like in the old main line. And after knight d4, queen d4, that a6 move that we saw earlier prevents the knight jumping into b5 and that threat. So that was sort of the idea behind a6. Queen e2, Abrahamyan plays f5. And this isn't the best move, but white has to respond accurately. The best response is probably a move like knight to a3, not recapturing en passant. And then after, say, pawn takes pawn, white can play rook to b1. The knight can go to c2 and control the d4 square. And white has a real clamp on black's position. But after f5, Carissa goes ahead and takes the pawn en passant, gf6. Now, in this position, black is doing fairly well with her massive pawns in the center. There's only one catch. Her king is in the middle of the board. So everything else is great for black. The nice massive pawns, the pieces are well developed. Everything's great except for that king in the center. And what that means is she has to be careful of tactics on every single move. If she is, then she'll probably be better when the dust settles. But one mistake and the game could be over. That's the risk you take when the king is in the middle of the board. cd4, knight d4, capturing on d4, bishop e3. And Abrahamyan plays queen to e5. A better move might have been queen to h4, moving that queen over by white's king. Black can play rook to g8, e5. The bishop might be able to come to h3 or g4. If the queen at e2 moves away, the pawn at h5 could fall. So queen to h4 would have been quite a strong move. She plays queen to e5. White plays knight to d2, getting the last minor piece off of the back rank. Rook to g8, aiming at the king. f4. So Carissa Yip weakens some squares, but what she's trying to do is just push that queen away from the king side. The queen has no way to do anything on the king side. She's just trying to push it away. Get away from here. Don't want you messing with my king. Tatev plays the queen to d6, queen f2, rook c8, rook a to d1. And so now black's king can't castle because both of the rooks have moved. So the king is still very much stuck in the middle of the king, is very much stuck in the middle of the board. So everything Carissa Yip has to do is to be aimed at getting that king in the middle. It could involve sacrifices. It's definitely got to involve some tricks. You'll notice here that this pawn at f6 is undefended, and that's going to be quite important here in a second. The best moves for black in this position are probably king to f7 to defend the f6 pawn, or even f5 directly. But she plays a very natural move, bishop to c6. Now this move looks very logical. It looks like a good move, aiming at the g2 square once the pawn at d5 moves. The bishop and the rook on g8 work together very well, but it's a blunder. And that's the danger of having your king in the middle of the board. She falls into Carissa Yip's trap, and now she springs it. Bishop to h7 is the first move, attacking the rook at g8, threatening to win the exchange. That rook moves, and now, boom, knight to e4. What a fantastic move. The pawn at d5 is pinned by the rook. So that knight on e4 is forking the queen at d6 and the pawn on f6, which would be taken with check. And that is really a strong idea. Queen to c7, now bishop to b6. She wants to move that queen into a bad position. If the queen were to go to d7, the knight to f6 check would actually fork the king and the queen. The only other move to save the queen, not that it saves anything really, it would be queen to b8, then knight to f6, check, king to f7, f5, and then if I move like e5, trying to keep the position closed, then bishop to g6, check. You can't take the knight because of queen to h4 check, or mate, I think. Knight takes g6, fg6 check, and in this position, the computer actually says it's mate in 12 here. I didn't bother to look at the line all the way through. Suffice it to say that in this position, queen to b8 does not work. So Tatev Abrahamyan says, okay, I'm just going to get as much as I can for my queen and try to play from there. So she takes the knight on e4, bishop takes c7, she takes the rook, the rook takes the bishop at h7, bishop to d6, rook to g7. Now, rook to c1 pins the bishop. The piece imbalance here is that white has the queen, black has two minor pieces for a pawn, but the bigger deal is still king safety. Black's king is still not safe. That's the real issue here. White is threatening bishop takes knight, followed by rook takes e4, and the bishop on c6 would be pinned. So if it takes the rook at e4, black would lose the rook at c8. Knight to f5, bishop takes f8, king takes f8, and now rook takes e4. If the rook is recaptured, rook is captured, then rook takes c8 check. Rook to d8, removing the pin. Rook to c6, giving back an exchange, but in return, getting a stronger position. Pawn takes rook. Rook takes e6, and threatening the pawns at c6 and f6. Knight to g3, rook to f6 check, king to e7. And now Carissa Yip ends this game in a very beautiful, sort of economic fashion. Really well done. Queen to c5 check, leaving the rook hanging. Abrahamyan takes the rook, king to f6, queen to e5 check, and in king f7, queen to c7 check. And she gets a rook in return. If the king goes to e8, the rook at g7 falls, and if the king moves anywhere else, the rook at d8 would be lost. And here Abrahamyan resigned. So a really interesting performance from Carissa Yip, and a real insight into this Milner-Berry gambit and how it's being played in the modern era. And a big congratulations to Carissa Yip on a tremendous achievement, the Women's United States Chess Champion. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.